Previously on the Criminalish podcast. Swami Satchidinanda was born C.K. Ramaswamy Gounder on December 22nd, 1914. Around 1949, Satchidinanda meets a Hindu monk named Swami Satchidinanda. He's also the one who quote-unquote initiated then C.K. Gowndry into being spiritual master Swami Satchidinanda. While in Europe, Satchidinanda also meets Peter Max in Paris and decides to visit the US with him. And this is when he opened up the first Integral Yoga location in New York. In 1969, he actually gave the opening invocation to the Woodstock Music Festival. And this appearance at Woodstock is what really threw him into the spotlight and brought about his notoriety as a guru. And his growth in popularity led him to several public engagements throughout the next decade, and did not only embark on a US tour, but a world tour. And to top that world tour off, the Integral Yoga Institute is established in San Francisco. In 1979, Satchidinanda acquired 600 acres in rural Buckingham County, Virginia, to establish the Satchidinanda Ashram, Yogaville. And the compound technically opened in 1980. Now, at the celebration of this opening, he apparently, quote, blessed Yogaville by dumping holy water onto the building dome while leaning out of a helicopter, end quote. The counterculture movement that was popular in the late 60s and 70s sort of shifts into satanic panic, and there's increasing scrutiny of cults. But at this time, Satchidinanda tries to stress that he is different from other cults, religious groups, and is accepting of many different religions. So again, for decades, Swami Satchidinanda enjoyed widespread acclaim, but in the early 90s, that carefully constructed image that he had built for himself, brick by brick over the last 30 years, finally began to crumble. And this came in the form of multiple public allegations of sexual misconduct and assault beginning in 1991. It was at this point that the public began questioning whether or not Yogaville was a cult. And one family actually wrote an article about their experience when they became entangled in Yogaville after their daughter, Catherine Chang, a law student, was reportedly recruited into Yogaville. And then in 2002, the guru, Swami Satchidinanda, dies at the age of 87. Hi, I'm Dev. And I'm Cam. And you're listening to Criminalish, a true crime podcast where two best friends trade stories ranging from the wild and wacky to the downright messed up. So, this is going to be part 2 of our Yogaville episode. In part 1, we covered Swami Satchidinanda's early life and his rise in fame as a guru in both India and the US, the founding of Integral Yoga and Yogaville, Satchidinanda's celebrity connections, as well as criticisms of Satchidinanda and Yogaville that included multiple sexual assault allegations against Satchidinanda, plus a testimonial from a family whose daughter joined Yogaville. Now, we covered all of those things and more in lots of detail, so we definitely recommend going back to listen to part 1 if you already haven't, because some of the things we discuss here in part 2 will build off of what we discussed in part 1. But before we get into part 2, what you drinking, friend? So, friend, today I'm bringing back an oldie, a thing I've probably had way too much, but it's goodie, I promise. And that's a brown sugar boba milk tea today. Now, the saddest part about it is my favorite boba shop closed. So I did have to go to my second favorite one, but the cup is so cute. It's so tiny and adorable. So that's what I'm drinking today. I also did put a shot of espresso in it to help pick me up. And that's what I got today.
What about you, Fran? What you drinking?
So today I am drinking elderberry lemonade. I got it from a little shop that is nearby. And yeah, it has lots of stuff in it. It has sea moss, apparently over 102 minerals. I needed something to pick me up, needed something a little sweet that also is supposedly good for me. I say supposedly because, sometimes with these things, they'll say it's got a lot of stuff in it. And maybe it's good for you, maybe it isn't. But the important part for me is that it tastes good.
There you go. There you go. That's really important.
So, before we get into the meat of part two, we will cover a couple things that we discussed in part one. First, the definition of a cult, and second, the psychology of cult leaders and followers.
So, as we get into today's episode, I want you guys to remember that apart from the minimal recap that we had at the top of the episode, Cam and I won't be doing any in-depth recaps of part one. So, again, if you haven't listened to part one, I'm judging you a little bit because how did you get here? But it's okay. It's okay. Just go do that and then come back right here. I've left a link in the description of this episode, so it's real easy for you to get right there. And it's important to listen to part one because we went over a lot of information that you will definitely need to know before listening to today's episode. But the two things that we will reiterate in today's episode is our definition of a cult and the psychology of cults. So a quick reminder, we define a cult as a social group defined by its religious, spiritual, or philosophical beliefs, practices, or devotion to a specific leader, object, or ideology, often considered unorthodox or outside mainstream society. Typically led by a charismatic figure who claims special knowledge or divine authority. Cults foster unwavering loyalty among followers. Their beliefs are often presented as the sole path to truth, salvation, or enlightenment, reinforcing dependence on the group while distancing members from the outside world. Members are expected to devote significant time, energy, and financial resources to the group, often at the expense of their personal relationships and well-being. Cults also maintain secrecy, restricting access to core teachings and rituals until members demonstrate a certain level of commitment, fostering a sense of superiority through their perceived exclusive knowledge.
And in discussing the psychology of cults, we broke down the psychology of both cult leaders and followers. For cult leaders, we talked about how researchers often see the dark triad of psychological traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Cult followers, on the other hand, are pretty demographically and psychologically diverse. However, researchers have noted that people are more susceptible to cults when they're going through significant life changes or dealing with intense depression, guilt, or anger. One thing that we also talked about when it comes to Yogaville is that many of the members of Yogaville come to Yogaville instead of Yogaville necessarily coming to them. So part of that is the fact that, in our opinion, Yogaville is a yoga-based cult. And a lot of times people seek out cults like these because they are looking for some type of transformative personal experience. Another part of that is that they have a pretty good online presence. One thing we discussed in part one is how oftentimes you'll see them say that Satchidinanda or Integral Yoga was the first or one of the first to do something. We will contend that Satchidinanda and Integral Yoga were likely one of the first to adopt the internet, and that has shown through into the present day as well. Even after Satchidinanda's death in 2002, Integral Yoga and Yogaville maintained a good online presence. Not only did they have a website, they were also active on social media. Specifically, they have a regular e-newsletter, a Facebook page, and even a multimedia function within Integral Yoga as an organization. In 2008, actually, Integral Yoga released an hour-long documentary that shows, quote, how the ancient teachings of yoga were brought to the West, end quote. Specifically, how Swami Satchidinanda was, again, one of the first to bring yoga to the West, and the documentary emphasizes the impact that this has had on stress management and health improvement as a whole across the country. What I found really interesting was that it makes a sweeping connection between the impact of Satchidananda's teachings and the impact of yoga as a whole, because the two are not synonymous. And we talked a little bit about the celebrity connections. Well, in this documentary, Dr. Oz makes an appearance and talks about blending yoga with medicine. And even if you just watch the trailer, you'll see that it follows this trend of painting Satchidananda as this guru who saved America from itself and whose teachings continue to live on. And we see this trend a lot, not only with Yogaville, but with other alleged cults. Even when their leader and founder dies, they make a large effort to immortalize this person through their teachings.
You're completely right on that, because I don't know if you saw my face. Yoga and Satchidananda are not synonymous with each other. My immediate thought was try telling them that because in their heads, there is no yoga without Swami Satchidinanda. And again, that's just another calling card of the cult-like behavior.
Exactly. But this media presence, including the documentary, their e-newsletters, all of that is what has kept them popular in the public eye. And one thing that was really interesting is when we were doing our research, it was actually fairly difficult to find a lot of negative criticism and deep dives about the connection between Yogaville and cult-like behavior. And you would actually see a lot more pushback against this idea on forums, in comment threads, in Reddit threads, all of that. So it's not just Integral Yoga Institute having an online presence. Yogaville's members also have an online presence, and they are out there on the interweb front lines defending their organization. And like I mentioned, Integral Yoga's media arm puts a lot of effort into painting Satchidananda as this guru, immortal figure who could do no wrong. But in October 2022, that started to change a little bit, because that's when Integral Yoga made a post titled Facts and Allegations Concerning the Late Swami Satchidananda. In this post, they detail Satchidananda's history as one of the first to bring yoga to the West. They contend that, though hearing about the sexual assault allegations has been difficult for everyone, seemingly including those who don't believe in them, because Satchidananda is dead, they cannot make any statement about what happened. Quote, "It is not possible for the organization to make a statement on his behalf or to definitively comment about consensual relationships or allegations of comments of a sexual nature or sexual advances that are alleged to have occurred 30 to 50 years ago." End quote. As part of this statement, they announced that they would be expanding their code of conduct policy. So I'm not exactly sure what it said before because I couldn't find the before version, but the current Yogaville Code of Conduct specifies that the following are against their code of conduct. Quote, "Unwanted or inappropriate physical contact, sexual advances, and other inappropriate behavior or harassment of a sexual or aggressive nature." End quote. It also contains instructions for reporting violations. So in the background of this, there was a lot happening. It seems like the rise of the Me Too movement in 2017 really spurred conversations about these sexual abuse allegations and brought a new light to them. This wasn't just specific to Yogaville. Members of yoga communities across the country and world contended with how power dynamics within yoga communities could contribute to unsafe environments and blur the lines of consent. But specifically for Yogaville, it was sort of a talked about fact that there were sexual assault allegations against Satchidananda, but this wasn't really anything that had been addressed by Integral Yoga or Yogaville as an organization. They got pushed again when a former Yogaville member named Shanti Norris sent 2 letters to the Integral Yoga Board in January and July of 2022. She actually says that these were what likely caused the board to release their own statement regarding the sexual assault allegations and their change to the code of conduct. Her first letter asked them to acknowledge the claims of sexual assault against Swami Satchidinanda as a board, and the second letter described in detail the relationship she had with him, something she had not previously done outside of friends and family. Specifically, she claimed that beginning in 1969, she had a 10-year off and on sexual relationship with Satchidananda during her 20s while she worked as his personal assistant. Reminder, Satchidananda was born in 1914, so during this alleged relationship, he would have been in his mid-50s to mid-60s. And while Shanti maintains that she entered into their relationship willingly, she claims that, quote, he took advantage of many of his female students' innocence and adoration and continually mimicked the life of a celibate monk while living differently, end quote. She also alleges that prior to their announcement, Integral Yoga Institute only addressed the allegations in one-on-one conversations with followers so that their statements could not be written down. So it seems like here we have two kind of conflicting things. On one hand, you have a organization that is very present in terms of the internet, social media, and other kinds of media. But on the other hand, you have an organization that puts a lot of effort into controlling the narrative around them and their guru.
And Cam is not wrong about that. So she's already broken down some of the media efforts of Yogaville to stay relevant and, in their own way, I guess, address the allegations poorly. I think we can all agree, very poorly, and in a way that screams, in my opinion, that they are guilty of something. But before we fully address all of that, I'm going to break down one of the more specific efforts of Yogaville, and that is keeping Yogaville open to the public and kind of addressing how the public looks at and views Yogaville today. So if you are unaware, you can actually book a stay and a retreat at Yogaville in Buckingham, Virginia. So the ashram is relatively publicly accessible. Now, in my opinion, this is simply a means to allow for recruiting and allow for people to join the cult more easily. But before we talk about that explicitly, I'm going to break down some of the experiences that have been reported on while staying at Yogaville East. But before we get into the specific instances, I want to give a very, very clear disclaimer. I'm about to get into the prices of staying at Yogaville, what they offer, what's included, all of that information. And I want to make it extremely, extremely clear that Cam nor I are encouraging you to go to Yogaville. Full stop. Neither of us are endorsing Yogaville. Neither of us have any affiliation to Yogaville in any way, shape, or form. And I am telling you this information because I found it interesting, and I felt like it would be good for you to have some kind of idea of the operations within Yogaville. But again, in no way, shape, or form are Cam and I encouraging you to go to Yogaville. We're not encouraging you to spend your money with Yogaville. And I just want to make that very, very clear before I get into this next set of information. You have been warned. So now that that's out of the way, Yogaville offers both day visits and personal retreats. And Yogaville specifically advertises their visits and personal retreats for, quote, attracting those seeking peace, reflection, spiritual inspiration, or a break from the stress of daily life, end quote. And included within your stay, you can participate in the ashram's daily schedule, which includes hatha yoga classes, which are twice a day, group meditations, which are 3 times a day, and evening programs with scripture study and chanting, as well as evening activities that vary. You can also visit the Light of Truth Universal Shrine, aka the Lotus, Chidambaram, and the Nataraja Shrine as part of your stay. Lodging has been described as sparse but clean and comfortable, and there are 2 options for your stay. These include non-co-ed dormitories and private rooms in the Lotus Guest House, which have private baths. It is also my understanding that the dormitories are non-co-ed and they only allow married couples to stay in the same private rooms. But if the private rooms were no longer available, it is highly likely that even if you were a married couple, you would not be able to stay in the same dormitory. Now, this piece of information isn't too important, but I just found it interesting and relevant considering the last episode we talked about Yogaville's shift to a more conservative mindset, and this still seems to be the case even to this day, even if you're married. But to get back into what's included at your lovely stay at Yogaville, 3 vegetarian meals a day are included in the cost. Vegan and gluten-free options are available. Meals are served in the Sivananda Hall. And again, it is my understanding that all meals are vegetarian only. Yogaville also encourages you to participate in other activities during your stay, such as taking advantage of the hiking and walking trails nearby, Another point of note is that Yogaville does not offer any kind of pickup service, so you will need to get yourself there. But there is a shuttle service from Yogaville to Charlottesville that is available only on Sundays. Now, of course, with any stay, there are restrictions that you will need to adhere to while staying at Yogaville. First things first is the dress code. Yogaville itself does not strictly enforce a specific attire, but generally requires all attire to be, quote, modest, end quote. And on Yogaville's website, they specifically outline what they mean by modest attire. Quote, please wear shorts or skirts close to the knee, tops close to the knees covering the thighs or leggings, wraps to cover shoulders and knees at ashram sacred venues, white or dressier clothes at satsang and special programs. It goes on to say, quote, please refrain from wearing footwear in ashram buildings except in lobbies. Footwear designated for indoors use only is okay. Torn clothing or clothing with holes, low cut or revealing tops, halters, or crop tops, and perfumes or essential oils, end quote.
I'd hate to have BO, and I'd hate to be near somebody that has BO, but I guess, maybe that's part of the acceptance of it all, being in tune with yourself and all your senses, is you get to experience all the good smells and the bad ones.
Maybe. Because I live and die by my perfume. I'm not going to lie to you.
Yeah, that one would hurt me. The dress code, all that stuff, I could do it. The perfume and essential oils would definitely hurt me.
Facts. I mean, it does at least say that we're allowed to wear deodorant. It doesn't say I can't wear deodorant. But True. Anything else to add to it, they said you need to smell natural as hell. So to continue, during your stay at Yogaville, alcohol, meat, and dairy are not allowed in any way, shape, or form, and access to caffeine is even limited. And lastly, you are required to adhere to their quiet hours. They specifically note, quote, silence is to be maintained between 10 p.m. and 8 a.m., end quote, which, to be very honest, is something that I think is very standard for most apartment complexes and hotels. So that's not all that weird. So I'm sure you're wondering, Dev, you've laid out all this information about Yogaville and what it's like to stay at Yogaville. But let's get to the brass tacks of it all. How much does it cost to stay at Yogaville? Well, my lovely listeners, watchers, and best friend, an all-inclusive day visit is going to cost you just $54. And this day pass can be purchased upon arrival at the front desk. You cannot book a day pass early. You must buy it on the premises the day that you show up. You'll simply pay at the door and no reservations are required. Now, if you're looking to stay for a personal retreat, the cost jumps up to $185 per day per person. But it does include all of your meals, yoga classes, and meditation. However, accommodations are complimentary and booked on a first come, first served basis. Now, this was a little unclear to me, but based on my understanding, it seems like if they run out of accommodations for you, you will simply have to find your own accommodations to stay the night. But I do believe you can camp on premises if you wanted to. I cannot confirm that fully. That is just my assumption. So yeah, it's $54 to go there for one day and $85 per day per person. But during certain periods, like their winter special that ended just at the end of February, sorry, you guys just missed it, a 20% discount might be applied. And Yogaville also offers discounts for senior citizens, military personnel, students, international visitors, and Integral Yoga Teacher Association members. And the discount may also apply if it's your first program with them and usually maxes out at about 20% off. And I believe this 20% discount can only be applied to the personal retreat, making your personal retreat about $148 per day per person after the discount is applied.
I will say for what you're getting, sans potential cult initiation, that's a fairly good price.
I agree. And Cam, you know who else would agree with you? The reviews of Yogaville. So now to get into some of the reviews of Yogaville, I want to state up front that the overall reviews of Yogaville are very positive, as Cam had mentioned before. They have a 4.6 out of 5-star rating on Google and a 4.5 out of 5-star rating on TripAdvisor. And one of the things I found very interesting is most of the negative reviews of Yogaville are solely based on the facilities, and it actually has zero to do with any of the allegations against Yogaville for being a cult or protecting Satchidinanda. And some of those negative reviews are 4, 5, 6, 10 years old. Most of the 1-star reviews on Google are things you would expect to see attached to any regular hotel review. Particularly, there are multiple reviews talking about the facilities themselves. Quote, "Rooms are very dated with small, uncomfortable beds and noisy AC," end quote. Or, "This place is very rustic. Our room had tons of ladybugs and stink bugs. The food is all vegan and not many choices. There are meditation and yoga classes offered, but we were too turned off by the food and room that we left after one night," end quote. Another 1-star review wrote, quote, "The people are very lovely here, but the living conditions are not quite good. There's bugs everywhere and they never take out the dead bugs on the window," end quote. There was one review that mentioned they experienced racism at Yogaville, but again, a one-off review. On Google, I only found one review that even used the word cult, which was, quote, "Research, please. I went with a friend in 2011. They only want you to stay here to finance their cult. Watch Wild Wild Country on Netflix. It's like a podunk version of that. Grow your patience at a studio or at home. Not here. It's just weird and icky," end quote.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing here is that in a lot of people's minds, cults are very clear because oftentimes we see and hear about cults once they've reached the crazy stage. And we hear about the Jonestown Massacre, we hear about Scientology, all of this. And so when we think of cults, we're like, oh yeah, I'll know if it's a cult because they're going to be chanting and holding hands in circles and doing weird rituals and stuff like that. No, many cults are going to be doing things, at least at first, that seem fairly normal and accepted. And they wait until you're pulled in to start doing the weird stuff.
Absolutely. The weird stuff never stays in the public eye until it's too late, honestly. Now, this is just something that I thought was really funny, and it's actually not relevant at all. But I just want you to know this information now that I know this information, which is on Google, the Yogaville account will respond to reviewers, pretty much all of their reviewers that actually leave like words as opposed to just the stars. And they always sign off as either, quote, "peace and light," end quote, or, quote, "wishing you peace and light," end quote. And I don't know why, but that was just really funny to me as I was reading these reviews of like, even the bad ones, they'll respond with, "We're sorry you had a negative stay. Wishing you peace and light." And I just thought that was funny.
Always got to stay centered.
You know, one within yourself. So similarly, when you look at TripAdvisor, you're going to see very normal reviews and feedback. The only review I found that even hinted about the cult-like activity was written in June of 2015 and stated, quote, "Creepy commune with too many rules. I was excited to check this place out. I am a longtime yoga student and meditator. The place has so many rules, it is hard to socialize with others and find a place of comfort. The private rooms are somewhat comfortable. The mosquitoes and spiders in the rooms were alarming, and the bathrooms could use an upgrade or remodel," end quote. And there were other reviews that mentioned that the facilities were not welcoming or accommodating. And in all honesty, the biggest complaints I found specifically on TripAdvisor is that the rooms need an upgrade. They haven't been upgraded since the 80s, and that the food is nasty. However, one of the big positive overarching themes is that most visitors describe Yogaville as a friendly and open atmosphere, but others have said that they feel a sense of emptiness and a lack of guidance or limited structured activities, particularly on personal retreats. As of 2015, around 220 people lived permanently in Yogaville, and 2,000 to 3,000 guests were visiting each year. So why did I give you all this background information about how to stay at Yogaville, what Yogaville is like now, the reviews, all of that information? Well, it was kind of to outline that Yogaville has remained in the public eye and it has not run away from the public eye. However, That would quickly change as the narrative around Yogaville starts to take a hard turn in 2023. As in 2023, Yogaville starts to face legal ramifications for the allegations that came out in the 90s. But before I get into what these legal ramifications are, I want to include some caveats before we get into this next phase of the episode. Caveat number one is that the legal ramifications we're going to talk about and deal with in this case are civil lawsuits. They are not criminal charges. Now, I know people are going to have a lot of questions about the criminality of cults, such as why is it so hard to prosecute a cult? Why are cult leaders not investigated and prosecuted immediately upon forming the cult? And why can't we just shut these cults down? And unfortunately, the answer to these questions is not as simple as it may seem. For one, in the United States and in many other countries, there's a strong emphasis on freedom of religion and freedom of assembly. This makes it difficult to prosecute groups based solely on their beliefs or practices, even if those beliefs seem strange or unconventional. To put it simply, starting a cult in the United States is not illegal. On top of that, there is no single universal accepted definition of what constitutes a cult. As you can see at the top of our episodes, we gave you our definition of a cult based on a series of other information that we pulled in. And this ambiguity makes it challenging for law enforcement and the courts to identify and target specific groups. So it's a very complex process in itself because you cannot prosecute somebody for starting a cult because it's not illegal unless the cult allows them to perpetrate illegal activity. To successfully prosecute a cult, it's actually necessary to demonstrate that the group's actions have caused direct harm to its members or others. But again, this can be difficult to prove, especially when the harm is psychological or emotional, as courts have determined that psychological harm, such as brainwashing, is not a crime. Given these challenges, prosecutors sometimes turn to racketeering charges to target cults. Racketeering laws like the RICO Act, and RICO stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization, in the United States, were initially designed to combat organized crime, such as with the mob or the cartel. However, they can also be applied to cults if the group engages in a pattern of illegal activity. These activities might include fraud, extortion, forced labor, sex trafficking, or financial crimes. And racketeering charges can be advantageous when attempting to prosecute cult leaders because they allow prosecutors to target the entire organization and its leadership rather than focusing on individuals and individual acts. They also carry significant penalties, including lengthy prison sentences and asset forfeiture. And I know that people feel a lot of different ways about racketeering charges at this point, especially because of the young thug of it all. You guys have already heard me express my immense frustration with the city of Atlanta for going after that stupid case anyway. But originally, these charges had good intentions of getting the big fish. They have just been subsequently poorly applied, we'll put it that way, by the city of Atlanta. Now, the last point I want to hit on is the legality of cults. And you heard me say that it is not illegal to start a cult in the United States, but the legal landscape differs in other countries. According to a 2009 Pew Research Center analysis, 41 countries banned at least one religion-related group and have laws that effectively make it illegal to start a group considered a cult by the government, meaning they can prosecute and restrict organizations deemed to be harmful practices or deviate significantly from established religious norms. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to identify if this specifically related to religious groups that have formed cults in those countries, but there is evidence to support that bringing a new religion into that country is definitely illegal. And this also applies to pre-established religious practices that we are very familiar with within the states, such as Jehovah's Witnesses, who are among the most frequently banned group. Now, some governments have cited security concerns, such as alleged links to violence, as a reason for imposing a ban. However, some governments use security concerns to target groups that pose a political threat, or the government may label religious groups as, quote, deviant, end quote. Some specific examples of banning and criminalizing religious groups include Russia, who have banned Jehovah's Witnesses, criminalizing their activity as extremist. Iran and Pakistan prohibits Ahmadis from calling themselves Muslim and bans them from preaching or trying to convert people. Uzbekistan criminalizes activity by unregistered religious groups and designates certain Islamic groups as extremist. And China also criminalizes groups that it considers to be, quote, cult organizations, end quote, such as the Falun Gong movement and several Christian groups, just to name a few. But to kind of close out this discussion and get into the civil lawsuits, I just wanted to provide some additional information to answer the questions that I'm sure people have when it comes to prosecuting cults and the legality of cults as a whole. And to understand that prosecuting cults is a delicate balance. And while the freedom of religion and assembly are fundamental rights in the United States, they are not absolute. And when a group's actions cross the line into illegal behavior and cause demonstrable harm, the law can and should intervene. So hopefully that gives you enough insight as to why a civil case was brought as opposed to criminal charges. But to finally get into the lawsuit, I'm going to do a relatively in-depth breakdown of all of the allegations presented by the plaintiffs and give you a very thorough overview of the lawsuit that was filed. If you are watching the YouTube video, I will be sure to include specific statements and quotes from the lawsuit on screen. So to get into it, on November 17th, 2023, at 10:51 a.m., plaintiffs Susan Cohen and Sharon Norris, whom you may have heard Cam refer to as Shanti Norris at the beginning of this episode, I just want to make it clear that this is the same person, but seemingly they went by different names at the time. But either way, they filed a lawsuit in the Supreme Court of the state of New York against the defendants Integral Yoga Institute and Satchidinanda Ashram Yogaville Incorporated under the Adult Survivors Act, also known as ASA, a New York state law giving victims of sexual offenses a 1-year look-back window to file civil claims outside of the statute of limitations. If you remember, this is the same statute that allowed Cassie and several other women to file lawsuits against Diddy and several other offenders. According to the preliminary statement of the lawsuit, quote, C.K. Ramaswamy Gounder, known by the alias Sri Swami Satchidinanda, used his network of yoga organizations to sexually abuse multiple women, including plaintiffs, over the course of at least a decade. In years past, when some of his victims came forward to share their stories, Swami Satchidinanda hid behind a large army of followers to disparage these brave women and deny their stories. Plaintiffs bring this action to stand up for all the victims of Swami Satchidinanda and at long last to remedy a grave injustice, end quote. The lawsuit then goes on to briefly explain who Swami Satchidinanda is, his methodology of integral yoga, his connection to several well-known American artists, and his initial exposure of providing the opening address at Woodstock. It then goes on to say, quote, plaintiffs were in their late teens when they joined the Institute in 1968 and 1969. Like many other young people at the time, they were drawn to Swami Satchidinanda's teachings about nonviolence, healthy living, and inner peace, end quote. It then goes on to say, quote, the Institute taught its students, including plaintiffs, that achieving inner peace required completely forfeiting their sense of self, and that living among an exclusive community in the service of Swami Satchidinanda was the best way to do that, end quote. The lawsuit continues by explaining the culture of complete obedience to Swami Satchidinanda and outlining some of the ways that Yogaville discouraged individuality and critical thinking, and that some members were expelled as a result of doing so. The lawsuit then goes on to state, quote, as his influence grew, Swami Satchidinanda began to surround himself with select young female students, including plaintiffs. He used the institute to hire these women into jobs that required spending time with him, usually alone and for extended periods. These female students were typically chosen after they were conditioned by the institute to completely obey and serve Swami Satchidinanda. Not long after spending some time alone with them, Swami Satchidinanda tested the obedience of his young employees. First, he instructed them to give him massages. With time, after he could be sure that the institute had succeeded in shifting their sense of bodily autonomy, Swami Satchidinanda sexually assaulted them. Afterwards, he would always order them to remain quiet, end quote. The lawsuit then goes on to say, quote, on information and belief, in addition to plaintiffs, Swami Satchidinanda sexually abused at least 10 of his female students from the 1960s to the 1990s. The institute stood by as the abuse occurred, failed to investigate, and actively encouraged it. By teaching young women to obey unquestioningly and require them to work closely alongside him, the institute was an integral component of Swami Satchidinanda's abuse scheme, end quote. The lawsuit then asserts that, quote, defendants continued to profit handsomely from their association with Swami Satchidinanda and his worldwide network of yoga organizations, end quote, and goes on to allege physical, psychological, and emotional injuries to the plaintiffs as a direct result of the inaction of defendants. The next part of the lawsuit breaks down who all important parties are, as well as the jurisdiction and venue. And now it's time to get into the factual allegations as presented by the plaintiffs in this case, Sharon Norris and Susan Cohen. The lawsuit starts by providing background information about Swami Satchidinanda, the Institute, Yogaville, and the history of abuse, all of which we have already broken down in our previous episode. So again, be sure to check that out. If you're this far in and you still haven't listened to part 1, you're just a rebel, I guess. And we actually encourage critical thinking and individuality here. So, you do you, boo.
Yeah, we got to respect it at this point.
Right. At this point, you're 45 minutes in? I'm going to let you have it. But in part 1 of our Yogaville series, I focused on the allegations that were made in the 90s with the information that was known in the 90s. However, the lawsuit has gone on to provide a lot more context and information, so I will be providing a lot more in-depth information about specific instances of abuse and sexual assault. So I also want to take this moment to extend trigger warnings for the next part of this episode. I'll be sure to leave exact timestamps in the description, and if you are watching on YouTube, it will be really easy for you to just click past all specific instances of abuse. So the lawsuit then goes on to state that, quote, from 1968 to 1979, Swami Satchidinanda sexually abused several of these female employees, end quote. And the first instance of sexual abuse that was brought up in the lawsuit is actually Sylvia Shapiro's account, which again, we talked about in part 1. The lawsuit goes on to state, quote, on information and belief, in or around 1971, Swami Satchidinanda sexually assaulted a student from the institute, Sylvia Shapiro. On information and belief, Swami Satchidinanda threatened Shapiro to not tell anyone about the abuse. On information and belief, in or around 1972, Shapiro informed the board of directors of the institute that Swami Satchidinanda had sexually abused her. On information and belief, in a meeting with the board, Swami Satchidinanda denied Shapiro's story, accused her of lying, and said he was too old for sexual activity. On information and belief, the institute then drove Shapiro out of the community. On December 14th, 1972, the Village Voice published an article stating that Swami Satchidinanda had been accused of sexually abusing a female student. It reported that Swami Satchidinanda denied the accusations by saying, quote, I am your master and therefore I shouldn't be questioned, end quote. The article also detailed divisions among the students and faculty of the institute regarding the abuse. On information and belief, in or around 1972, several faculty members and students who believed Shapiro's story departed the institute, end quote. So as you can see, the lawsuit has shed some light on exactly what Sylvia went through. and how her story was not believed by the majority of Yogaville. And unfortunately, as you continue to go through the lawsuit, you find out that this is not a unique handling of the situation, as, quote, on information and belief, in or around 1973, Swami Satchidinanda sexually assaulted another female student from the institute. On information and belief, in or around 1973, Swami Satchidinanda forcibly touched another female student from the institute and attempted to sexually assault her, end quote. The lawsuit then goes on to explain the opening of Yogaville in Buckingham, Virginia, and briefly describes the allegations that came out in the early 90s, which we covered in our last episode. The next part of the lawsuit focuses on the plaintiffs, starting with Sharon Norris. It begins by explaining that Sharon was living, working, and going to college in New York City and was recommended to go and attend a speech by Swami Satchidinanda from a friend, and quickly fell into the workings of Yogaville. She took yoga classes there, studied to become a yoga teacher, and regularly associated with the institute. And it goes on to say that Sharon officially moved into the institute's residence at 500 West End Avenue in August of 1968. The lawsuit then goes on to illustrate one of the many instances of Swami Satchidinanda making Sharon feel very uncomfortable. Quote, in or around January 1969, Swami Satchidinanda was auditioning students to join him on stage for a speech at Carnegie Hall. Before the speech, at the institute, in the presence of other students, Swami Satchidinanda instructed Norris to demonstrate yoga poses for him. As she performed the various movements, Norris felt Swami Satchidinanda stare excessively at her body and look it up and down. Soon after this uncomfortable interaction, Swami Satchidinanda selected Norris to join him on stage for the speech, end quote. The lawsuit then goes on to describe an instance of abuse in 1969 after Swami Satchidinanda met Sharon and some of his other students for dinner at an Indian restaurant in Harlem, New York. According to the lawsuit, quote, on the return drive to the institute, Swami Satchidinanda invited Norris to sit with him in the front passenger seat of the car, a Volkswagen Beetle, which has room for only one passenger in the front. The other passengers sat in the back seat. Swami Satchidinanda instructed Norris to sit on his lap and proceeded to fondle her breast without her consent, out of the view of other passengers. Norris froze and did not react, end quote. The lawsuit then goes on to explain that shortly after this incident, Swami Satchidinanda offered Sharon a job at the institute, and upon being offered said job, Sharon quit her other job, gave up her college scholarship, left college, and accepted the offer fully. This job included managing Swami Satchidinanda's calendar and traveling with him for speeches and appearances, as well as giving him massages. The lawsuit then goes on to say that, quote, obeying Swami Satchidinanda, end quote, was ingrained in her job description. And as compensation for this work, Sharon was granted room and board at Yogaville. According to the lawsuit, quote, over the course of Norris' employment at the institute, Swami Satchidinanda regularly probed and enforced her subservience by demanding that Norris do everything and anything for him, by taking care of correspondence to giving him baths, from filming and photographing events to taking care of his pets. Norris consistently acquiesced to Swami Satchidinanda's demands because she understood she was required to obey, end quote. The lawsuit then goes on to reference another instance of abuse that took place in July of 1969, while Sharon accompanied Satchidinanda to Los Angeles, California. Again, I'm going to be talking about a specific instance of abuse. If you do not wish to hear it, please skip forward about 3 minutes or so. Quote, on July 20th, 1969, Norris and Swami Satchidinanda watched television coverage of the first walk on the moon. That evening, Swami Satchidinanda spoke with Norris about the importance of trust between a student and teacher, and he indicated that she was progressing well in her employment as his assistant. Swami Satchidinanda then told Norris that a student must be completely naked in front of their teacher. Understanding this to be a metaphor, Norris replied that she was willing. Swami Satchidinanda then instructed Norris to remove her clothes and stand completely naked in front of him. In a state of confusion, but fulfilling her expectations as a student and employee, she complied. Norris disrobed in a nearby bathroom and presented herself naked to Swami Satchidinanda, who then embraced her, commended her for her obedience, and covered her body with a blanket. The next day, on July 21st, 1969, Swami Satchidinanda summoned Norris to massage his legs in bed. This time, however, as Norris massaged his legs, Swami Satchidinanda pulled on Norris's arm and signaled her to lay down. Then, Swami Satchidinanda sexually assaulted Norris. He forcibly penetrated her vagina with his penis. During this assault, Norris froze. She had not consented to having sex with Swami Satchidinanda. After the assault concluded, Swami Satchidinanda instructed Norris to keep it secret because he was publicly celibate. Norris did as she was told and remained quiet because she understood it was her duty to assist him, to obey him, and she feared that if she resisted or said no, that she would lose her job at the institute and be driven out of the community. From 1969 to around 1971, Swami Satchidinanda sexually assaulted Norris at least once a week while she traveled to the United States with him, employed as his assistant. Swami Satchidinanda also sexually assaulted Norris at the Institute in New York City, where students and teachers observed her entering and leaving his room late at night. Swami Satchidinanda also sexually assaulted Norris at a rental ashram in upstate New York, where the Institute required her to spend extended periods with him alone, often at night and overnight. Swami Satchidinanda demanded both oral sex and vaginal sex." End quote. The lawsuit then concludes Sharon's accounts by explaining that the Institute strongly discouraged her from having contact with her family or friends outside of the Institute, despite the fact that she was becoming very overwhelmed and growing in resentment towards Yogaville as a whole. Quote, "She felt that she was losing control over her body. Norris did not want to have sex with Swami Satchidinanda, but worried she would be removed from her position as an assistant if she resisted him, said no to him, or told anyone else about the abuse." End quote. Eventually, however, quote, "Norris found the courage to tell Swami Satchidinanda that she felt he was using her for sex. He disregarded her feelings and went on to mock and mimic her repeatedly for expressing herself. From around 1971 to 1979, Swami Satchidinanda assaulted Norris on a regular basis in hotel rooms while she traveled with him, employed as his assistant." End quote. As you can imagine, the lawsuit goes on to explain that Sharon felt used by her guru solely for his sexual gratification, but she feared the consequences of not obeying Swami Satchidinanda, whether that be being terminated from the institute or being driven out of the community. As remember, by this time, she had already quit her other job and left college, so Yogaville had thoroughly isolated her by this point. However, quote, "By 1979, Norris had become so weighed down by the years of abuse by Swami Satchidinanda that she finally resigned from the institute to get away from him." End quote. And that concludes Sharon's allegations from the lawsuit.
I mean, based on her account, I can't imagine going through anything like that. And we've already stated that with centers and organizations like Yogaville, who put not only someone like Satchidananda, their guru, in a very high position, but also different yoga teachers and other yoga experts that may come in a higher position. You already have this power differential that makes consent very murky. And also, she was so young in comparison to Satchidananda. She was in her 20s. She quit her job. She quit school. Yogaville was everything. And then I feel like there's also the sunk cost fallacy. You know, I've already put so much time and energy into this. I've got to see it through. On top of that, there is the nature of Yogaville and Integral Yoga. It's not really a place where you can say critical things about the Guru Satchidananda, especially at a point when he is still alive and in his prime. So all of that, I feel, was working against her. during that time. And I think the worst part about it is that it's still working against her and other members to this day. One thing that I found especially icky about the statement that Integral Yoga made in 2022 was them basically saying, oh, we're not going to get involved with Satchidananda's supposed sexual relationships. Basically, glossing over the fact that these weren't sexual relationships, these are sexual assault allegations. Allegations that these were non-consensual sexual relationships. And then basically saying, yeah, that's not our business. What he did in his bedroom is not our business. Actually, it is, because you allowed these things to happen.
I completely agree with you, Cam. And especially, I think it's very interesting that you guys want to minimize and try to be like, oh, well, you know, his sex life isn't that important. And it is that important because you guys allowed him to present himself as a celibate monk. That was part of the marketing of Swami Satchidinanda, was the fact that he was a celibate monk whose wife had either died or left him. That's still up in the air. But that was the whole persona that you put forward. So it actually does matter. And you're not just going to sneakily remove it from the website and act like that wasn't something that you put forward and something that he was aware of as he perpetrated these assaults against these women. So if he knew it was important, you guys for damn sure know it's important.
Yeah, if he's telling these girls and women that they have to keep their relationship secret, something tells me he knew something about it was wrong. Something tells me if people knew what was actually going on, they would lose trust in him. They wouldn't follow him.
It's almost like he made it a defining characteristic that people expected of him. And the sexual relationships that were happening in his bedroom directly reflect and go against this persona that he has presented for himself. Because yoga guru doesn't hit the same way if it actually turns out that you're a sexual deviant, a sexual assaulter, a rapist even. Doesn't hit the same way, does it? So as I descend my soapbox, the next part of the lawsuit is about Susan Cohen's experiences with Yogaville. And it explains that in July of 1969, Susan was 17 years old, living in Queens, New York, when she went to the Newport Folk Festival in Rhode Island. There, she met two students from Integral Yoga Institute who were essentially introducing festival attendees to the teachings of Swami Satchidinanda. And Susan was very attracted to the ideology. And her interest in Yogaville seemed to move very quickly as, quote, in or around August 1969, Cohen moved to Manhattan, got a part-time job, and became involved in the Institute. She attended lectures by Swami Satchidinanda, took yoga classes, and eventually learned how to teach yoga. During this time, the Institute taught Cohen the essentials of integral yoga, including how to surrender her sense of self. The institution taught her how to control her mind and suppress her emotions with the goal of behaving in a subservient manner. In or around 1970, Cohen personally met Swami Satchidinanda at the Institute. In the summer of 1970, Cohen moved into an apartment with another student near the Institute. She quit her part-time job and accepted an employment offer from the Institute to be a cook in the communal kitchen, end quote. It goes on to explain that Susan also worked in exchange for room and board, just like Sharon. And quote, by the fall of 1970, Cohen was working full-time at the Institute as a cook, yoga teacher, and receptionist. Cohen worked 6 days a week, end quote. Similarly to the experiences of Sharon, Susan was also discouraged from having contact with her family or friends outside of the Institute, and it was shortly after this that Susan began having personal trainings with Swami Satchidinanda. And in those personal training sessions, quote, over the course of many months, he instructed her to practice obedience. He told her to tell herself, quote, don't think, don't question, end quote. Eventually, by early 1971, Cohen had stopped making decisions for herself. Her entire life was about serving the Institute and obeying Swami Satchidinanda, end quote. And after months of telling Susan to completely surrender herself to him, she does. And, quote, in or around 1971, the Institute began to require Cohen, as part of her employment, to serve Swami Satchidinanda meals and give him foot massages in his residence at the Institute, end quote. Again, at this point, I'm going to extend another trigger warning as I'm about to get into a series of events of both sexual and emotional abuse, and I will leave an exact timestamp for when I am finished talking about this particular topic. So, according to the lawsuit, quote, Swami Satchidinanda began to ask Cohen about her sexual experiences while they were alone in his residence at the Institute. During one such discussion, Swami Satchidinanda touched Cohen's face and fondled her breasts without her consent. On another occasion, Swami Satchidinanda instructed Cohen to perform oral sex on him while they were alone in his residence at the Institute. He told her, quote, use your mouth, end quote. At the time, Cohen did not tell anyone about these incidents because she feared that she would lose her job and be driven out of the community at the Institute. After these assaults, Swami Satchidinanda began to personally discourage Cohen from having friendships with men. On one occasion, he sent a male friend of Cohen's away from the Institute. On another occasion, he instructed Cohen to cease all contact with another male friend. In or around 1972, Sylvia Shapira accused Swami Satchidinanda of sexual abuse, and rumors of the matter spread throughout the Institute. Cohen, plagued with doubt, considered leaving the Institute and enrolling in college. But before Cohen could make a final decision, the Institute offered her a new job as Swami Satchidinanda's secretary. Cohen suppressed her doubt, dutifully accepted the new role, and remained at the Institute. Cohen's job duties as secretary required her to travel with Swami Satchidinanda for appearances and speeches. The Institute required Cohen to completely obey Swami Satchidinanda while working with him. Over the course of her employment as his secretary, Swami Satchidinanda regularly commanded Cohen to avoid dating men. In or around 1972, Cohen traveled with Swami Satchidinanda as secretary to Europe and Israel. The Institute arranged for Cohen and Swami Satchidinanda to sleep in adjoining hotel rooms. On several occasions on this trip, Swami Satchidinanda instructed Cohen to give him a massage. During the massage, he often interrogated Cohen about the details of her dating life. On at least one occasion during the trip to Europe and Israel, Swami Satchidinanda sexually assaulted Cohen. She did not tell anyone about it because she feared losing her job and being driven out from the community at the Institute. Cohen saw what had happened to Shapiro and did not want to suffer the same fate. In or around 1973, Cohen traveled with Swami Satchidinanda, employed as his secretary, to a yoga retreat in Dallas, Texas. The Institute again arranged for Cohen and Swami Satchidinanda to sleep in adjoining hotel rooms. On at least one occasion during this trip to Dallas, Swami Satchidinanda sexually assaulted Cohen. Cohen did not tell anyone about it for the same reasons as the previous assaults. In or around 1974, Cohen traveled with Swami Satchidinanda, employed as his secretary, to a conference in Chicago, Illinois. The Institute again arranged for Cohen and Swami Satchidinanda to sleep in adjoining hotel rooms. On at least one occasion during this trip to Chicago, Swami Satchidinanda sexually assaulted Cohen, and Cohen did not tell anyone about it for the same reasons as the previous assaults. In or around 1974, Cohen relocated to the Institute's ashram in Pomfret, Connecticut. Thereafter, she rarely worked with Swami Satchidinanda. However, in or around 1975, Cohen traveled with Swami Satchidinanda, employed as his secretary, to a yoga retreat in Santa Barbara, California. The Institute arranged for Cohen and Swami Satchidinanda to stay together at one of their ashrams in a remote location where there were no visitors. On at least one occasion during this trip to Santa Barbara, Swami Satchidinanda sexually assaulted Cohen. Cohen did not tell anyone about it for the same reasons as the previous assaults. In or around 1977, Cohen began dating her current husband. Shortly thereafter, Swami Satchidinanda told Cohen that he disapproved of her relationship. In or around 1980, Cohen left the Institute's ashram in Pomfret, Connecticut, and disassociated from the Institute's community. In or around 1991, Cohen began speaking publicly about the sexual abuse by Swami Satchidinanda. Her story was featured in several U.S. and Canadian newspapers. On at least one occasion, in or around 1999, Yogaville contacted Cohen and requested that she remove a testimonial from the internet she had published about her sexual abuse by Swami Satchidinanda, end quote. And that concludes Susan's allegations as presented in the lawsuit.
Again, I hope people understand why they are bringing this lawsuit against Integral Yoga and Yogaville as organizations, because these things didn't happen in a vacuum. These things happened because the Institute enabled this environment not only to exist, but to flourish. You allowed him to book adjoining hotel rooms when, interestingly, you don't even allow people of different sex to stay in the same dormitory on your Yogaville campus. You allegedly suppressed allegations of assault against Satchidinanda. This is why you're being named in a lawsuit.
Exactly. And I think specifically the fact that Susan knew about what happened to Sylvia, that tells me everything I need to know about the board's understanding of what's happening. Because the defense in this case is always going to be, oh, well, we didn't know. We didn't know that was happening. We didn't know that was going on. That's always the defense. But it can't be, because it's been proven that you knew. It's been proven that she went and talked to several board members, and then she was subsequently ran out. And then you still allowed Swami Satchidinanda complete access to these young women, knowing that he had assaulted at least one of them, or he had allegations of assaulting at least one of them. And personally, allegations are enough for me to not allow that individual around me or anybody I care about or anything that's important to me ever again. And that's not a step you took. So the next part of the lawsuit then goes on to break down the causes of action by the plaintiffs against all the defendants, being Integral Yoga and Swami Satchidinanda Ashram, Yogaville, Incorporated. The first cause of action is neglect and alleges, quote, plaintiffs held defendants in a special position of trust and confidence by virtue of their status as students and employees living on defendants' premises to work and study, and reasonably relied on defendants to keep plaintiffs safe and prevent unreasonable harm. At the time of the alleged acts, Swami Satchidinanda was acting in his capacity as an agent and or employee of defendants within the course and scope of his agency duties for defendants as director, executive, and leader, and while furthering their interests. Defendants owed a duty of care to plaintiffs to, inter alia, properly supervise their employees, ensure their premises were safe, investigate allegations of misconduct, keep students and employees free from harm, prevent foreseeable harm, and warn of unsafe or dangerous conditions that could foreseeably arise. At all times relevant and material hereto, defendants knew or should have known that Swami Satchidinanda had a propensity to sexually harass and sexually assault female students and employees on their premises. At all times relevant and material hereto, defendants knew that the institute was not safe, and it was foreseeable that plaintiffs and others similarly situated would be sexually assaulted and subjected to maltreatment, end quote. The lawsuit then goes on to elaborate that Yogaville should have known about the possibility that they were putting plaintiffs as well as other students in danger by allowing them to be in close proximity to Swami Satchidinanda alone, and that the institute not taking action against Swami Satchidinanda caused harm to Sharon and Susan. The second cause of action is sexual discrimination, and it alleges, quote, at all relevant times, plaintiffs were employed by defendants as a cook, assistant, and or a secretary to Swami Satchidinanda. Swami Satchidinanda's above referenced statement and conduct amounted to unwelcome sexual conduct towards plaintiffs. Defendants knew or should have known about Swami Satchidinanda's unwelcome sexual conduct towards plaintiffs and condoned and or acquiesced in it. The unwelcome sexual conduct was linked explicitly and or implicitly to the basis for employment decisions affecting compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of plaintiffs' employment, including but not limited to the fact that plaintiffs would be demoted or terminated if they did not comply with Swami Satchidinanda's demands. Swami Satchidinanda's behavior constituted quid pro quo sexual harassment under the New York State human rights law, end quote. The third cause of action is gender-motivated violence, which alleges, quote, the above described conduct of Swami Satchidinanda, including but not limited to Swami Satchidinanda's sexual abuse, constitute, quote, crimes of violence, end quote, and, quote, crimes of violence motivated by gender, end quote, against plaintiffs as defined by the New York City Victims of Gender-Motivated Violence Protection Law. These acts against plaintiffs constitute felonies or misdemeanors that presented a serious risk of physical injury to plaintiffs. The above described conduct of Swami Satchidinanda, including but not limited to Swami Satchidinanda's sexual abuse of plaintiffs, constitutes a, quote, crime of violence, end quote, against plaintiffs motivated by their gender, on the basis of their gender, and or due, at least in part, to an animus based on their gender. Swami Satchidinanda committed a, quote, crime of violence, end quote, against plaintiffs because they were women, and at least in part because he had an unlawful animus towards women. Swami Satchidinanda's gender-motivated animus towards women is demonstrated by, among other things, his sexually violent and abusive treatment of multiple women, not merely limited to plaintiffs. Defendants are liable for Swami Satchidinanda's commission of many crimes of violence because they enabled the commission of the crimes by, inter alia, regularly allowing him access to plaintiffs alone, requiring that plaintiffs give him massages, a requirement of their employment, requiring plaintiffs to sleep near him and be alone at night and overnight with him on required work travel, and bestowing upon him power, fame, and prestige, end quote. It goes on to say that plaintiffs have suffered long-term physical injury as well as serious psychological and emotional distress as a result of defendants enabling Swami Satchidinanda's gender-motivated violence. The fourth cause of action is negligent supervision and retention, in which the plaintiffs allege, quote, Swami Satchidinanda used his position of authority through employment with defendants to sexually assault and sexually harass plaintiffs on defendants' premises, using defendants' property or using resources available to him as a director, executive, and leader. Defendants' conduct described herein, including the negligent retention and supervision of Swami Satchidinanda and affirmative acts that covered up and empowered him to commit sexual assaults and sexual harassment, resulted in the commission by him of further sexual assaults and sexual harassment against plaintiffs. Defendants knew, reasonably should have known, or were negligent or recklessly indifferent to the fact that he had a propensity to engage in sexual assault and sexual harassment, and that he would use his position within defendants' organizations to induce plaintiffs, under the pretense of their employment, to sexually harass and sexually assault them. Defendants had a duty of care to plaintiffs as students and employees to properly hire, train, retain, supervise, and discipline their employees to avoid unreasonable harm to others or to take steps to alleviate harm caused by their employees' affirmative conduct. Defendants breached their duty of care to plaintiffs by, among other things, failing to terminate Swami Satchidinanda, remove him from a position of authority, or take steps to warn or otherwise reduce the risk that he would use his position of power within defendants' organization to continue to sexually harass and sexually assault female students and employees, end quote. It goes on to say that defendants are directly responsible for the abuse that happened to the plaintiffs, since they failed to supervise Swami Satchidinanda or remove him from a position of power. Quote, the conduct described herein by defendants was willful, wanton, and malicious. At all relevant times, defendants acted with conscious disregard of plaintiffs' rights, feelings, and well-being, and acted with the knowledge of or reckless disregard to the fact that their conduct was certain to cause injury and or humiliation to plaintiffs and other similarly situated students and employees, end quote. The fifth and final cause of action is sexual discrimination, where the plaintiffs allege, quote, at all relevant times, plaintiffs were employed by defendants as a cook, assistant, and or secretary to Swami Satchidinanda. Swami Satchidinanda's above referenced statements and conduct amounted to an unwelcome sexual conduct towards plaintiffs. Defendants knew or should have known about Swami Satchidinanda's unwelcome sexual conduct towards plaintiffs and condoned and or acquiesced in it. The unwelcome sexual conduct was linked explicitly and or implicitly to the basis for employment decisions affecting compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of plaintiffs' employment, including, but not limited to, the fact that plaintiffs would be demoted or terminated if they did not comply with Swami Satchidinanda's demands. Plaintiffs suffered discrimination as a direct result of defendants' conduct. End quote. The lawsuit ends with a prayer for relief, or what the plaintiffs are seeking in this matter, which reads, quote, "Wherefore the amount in controversy exceeds the jurisdictional limits of all lower courts, and plaintiffs demand judgment against defendants for compensatory damages, pain and suffering, punitive damages, attorney's fees, the cost and disbursements of this action, and such other and further relief as the court deems necessary, just, and proper." End quote. The lawsuit concludes by the plaintiffs demanding a jury trial in this action. So I know I just threw a lot of information at you as we did a very thorough and complete breakdown of the entire lawsuit and all of the pertinent allegations. And I read most of the lawsuit because I wanted you to hear it in their words, not mine. So before we get into Yogaville's response to this lawsuit, tell me what you're thinking, Cam, and what are you feeling right now?
Yeah, I know we've already talked a little bit about Sharon and Susan's specific accounts. And one thing I really want to focus on is the cause of action related to gender discrimination. And throughout Sharon's account, Susan's account, and other accounts that you'll see as you may look into this on your own, you'll see that Satchidinanda specifically hired women to be his assistants. In the first part of our Yogaville series, we talked about how Satchidinanda apparently believed that women belonged in the home. Women don't need to work. And I think that that is partly coming from his belief in that, but it's also because, in my opinion, he wanted women in those positions so that he had more access to them so that he could do what he wanted. Not only were they spiritually and emotionally dependent on him, they were now even more financially dependent on him. And I think it's very telling that he apparently never had a man in the role of his assistant.
And honestly, Cam, I'm going to take it one step further because I find it extremely interesting that he never had an older woman in that position. The position of his assistant was always a woman who was in her either late teens or early 20s. It was never a woman who was, say, in her late 30s, early 50s, something like that. Never the case. It was always young women. And there's plenty of older women at Yogaville. And I also find it particularly interesting for the same point that you brought up, that he would rather see a woman in rags than to see her go to work. But is she not working for you? Does it not count if she works for you? Or do you not see secretarial work as work because you are viewing these women as objects? Just a little food for thought, something for you guys to think about at home. So after this lawsuit is filed, there is a big stir in the greater yoga and guru community, and it puts a really negative spotlight on Yogaville. But in response to Sharon and Susan's lawsuit, Yogaville filed counterclaims for tortious interference with business relationships and libel and slander, arguing that the allegations of sexual assault are false and intended to harm the Institute financially.
And that is where we'll end part 2 of our Yogaville series.
Next time on the Criminalish podcast, Sharon and Susan's lawyers filed a motion to dismiss these counterclaims, arguing they constituted a strategic lawsuit against public participation, or a SLAPP suit. And the Supreme Court of New York has already ruled on this motion as of December 17th, 2024, so relatively recently. And we have their response, which mentions the allegations that were in Yogaville's counterclaim. You remember how I mentioned that Swami Satchidinanda, as well as Yogaville itself, had a connection with Doc Antle? Well, now Cam is going to break down for you what that connection is and why it is so important to explain all of the previous allegations.
So, like we mentioned, Doc Antle, who you may know from his appearance in the Tiger King documentary, was very involved in integral yoga and Yogaville from the early days. The documentary that followed Tiger King about Doc Antle uncovered accusations that he created a cult-like atmosphere at his zoo. Part 3 will be out next Friday, April 25th. That is, if you're not a member of our Patreon. Patreon members can actually listen to the third and final part of the Yogaville series right now. Our members also get exclusive access to things like our reactions to and coverage of current events, body cam videos, and much more. And as we wrap up today's discussion, we are going to move into our segment called Today in Crime, where we describe a crime or a crime-related event that took place on this day. So, on April 18th, 2002, Robert Blake was arrested and charged with the May 2001 murder of his wife, Bonnie Lee Backley, which occurred outside of an LA restaurant they were both dining at while Bonnie was sitting in their parked car and Robert was inside the restaurant. Robert Blake, who is an actor well known for starring in the 70s television hit Beretta, was immediately suspect number 1 for police. According to initial reports, Robert told police that he had returned to the restaurant after escorting his wife to the car because he needed to retrieve a gun that he'd left inside the restaurant. When he got back to the vehicle, he found his wife dead. And when police paired Robert's explanation with reports that the couple had a shaky relationship, they found a lot of room for suspicion. The police investigation continued for nearly a year until Robert was arrested. At the trial that began in late 2004, he maintained his innocence while the prosecution presented a case built largely on circumstantial evidence. They highlighted his presence at the scene, his seemingly unusual behavior after the shooting, and the fact that he had a motive, though they didn't really clearly establish what this motive was, other than wanting his wife dead and them having problems. They also brought up the discovery of a handgun found in a dumpster near the crime scene that they alleged to be the murder weapon, but could not definitively link to Robert. There were also reports that Robert allegedly tried to hire people to kill Bonnie, but the credibility of these witnesses came under intense scrutiny during the trial. Robert's defense team worked hard to dismantle the prosecution's case by attacking the reliability of said witnesses and pointing out potential ulterior motives and questionable backgrounds. They argued that the prosecution had failed to provide concrete evidence directly linking Robert to the crime. In March 2005, the jury delivered a verdict of not guilty, sending shockwaves throughout the media and the public and making many wonder whether justice had been served. However, this was not the end. Bonnie Lee Backley's family pursued a civil lawsuit against him for her wrongful death. In civil court, the burden of proof is lower than in a criminal trial. So in 2008, the civil jury found Robert Blake liable for Bonnie's death and awarded her family $30 million in damages. This was later reduced to $15 million due to Robert Blake's bankruptcy. Robert consistently maintained his innocence until his death, and his career never fully recovered from his legal trouble. Robert ended up passing away at his home in Los Angeles in 2023 at the age of 89 due to long-term heart disease. If you found this story interesting, leave an old-timey camera emoji in the comments.
Yeah, friend. The more you kept talking about the case, the more I kept saying, there's no way they're going to find him guilty of this. Because in my head, I was like, you can't connect him to the murder weapon. The alleged murder weapon isn't confirmed to be the murder weapon. I'm not going to sit here and act like his story makes any sense. His story absolutely stinks. But his story puts him inside the restaurant. Allegedly, he's got these people saying that he was trying to kill his wife, but even that's shaky evidence. And if the only thing that you have for him to want her dead is that they had a bad relationship, you can't even sneak out a life insurance policy that might have been worth a lot of money. It might be unpopular, but I think this is the case where justice does prevail, where the jury got it right. Because at the end of the day, if you don't have concrete evidence of somebody committing a crime, they shouldn't be found guilty of that crime. Even if I think all of his movements are suspicious, I don't want anybody to think that I don't find what he's saying suspicious and to be a heaping pile of horse. But if there's no evidence, there's no evidence. And you can't convict people without any evidence.
Exactly. And this is a case where maybe he did do it, but maybe he didn't. And that's the whole point of a trial, is proving beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody is guilty. And they just couldn't do that here.
Exactly.
Any other thoughts, friend?
Nope. That's all I've got.
Thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode. We used so many sources that we can't really include all of them right now, but be sure to check out the episode description where we will include all of the sources that we used. If you'd like to check out photos related to this case, follow us at Criminalish Podcast on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube.
Listeners, if you like what you hear, be sure to leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening to Criminalish Podcast. And if you're listening on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to our channel and feel free to leave any comments or questions. As always, stay nosy, my friends. Bye.
Bye.